Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about a year that doesn't just make your worst day seem like a picnic, but makes the Black Death look like a mild flu season, and world wars seem like distant, almost quaint historical footnotes. Forget your modern anxieties about gas prices, your fleeting discomforts, or that annoying coworker. Those are luxuries of a stable, sunlit world. Imagine, if you can, a world where the very sun itself, the giver of life, betrayed you, where the sky turned a perpetual, ominous twilight, the air grew bitterly, relentlessly cold, and starvation became not just a distant threat, but a grim, unavoidable reality for entire continents, stretching across the known world. We're going to rip open the history books, consult the latest cutting-edge scientific discoveries, and plunge headfirst into the year 536 AD, why it was the worst year to be alive. And let me tell you, if you were plucked from your comfortable, climate-controlled existence, your fridge full of food, your reliable internet connection, and your access to modern medicine, and abruptly dropped into that year, you wouldn't just struggle to survive. Your modern spirit, your very understanding of normality, of hope, of human endurance, would utterly shatter within weeks, if not days. This was not a test of strength. It was an annihilation of the everyday. Before we descend into this often uncomfortable truth, tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? Are you nestled in a cozy modern home, perhaps enduring a long commute, or simply seeking a moment of quiet reflection, hidden from the general chaos of life? Drop a comment below and let me know your location and the time. And if this kind of unvarnished storytelling brings you even a sliver of peace, or at least keeps you from the endless scroll of modern anxieties, then a quick like and subscribe would be deeply appreciated. It's oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to the same slow march through history. So picture this, vividly. You wake up on what should be an ordinary morning, in what is now modern-day Europe, perhaps in the bustling Byzantine capital of Constantinople, the shimmering heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, or maybe a quiet, seemingly idyllic farmstead in Anglo-Saxon England, or even a thriving city in ancient China. You instinctively expect the familiar warmth of the rising sun, the comforting glow of dawn breaking over the horizon, painting the sky with vibrant hues, but it doesn't come. Instead, the world outside your window is bathed in a perpetual, eerie twilight, a dim, sickly gloom that clings to everything and never truly lifts. The sun, when it appears at all through the thick atmospheric haze, is a ghostly, pale orb, giving off no real heat, radiating no life, like a distant, dying star, devoid of its life-giving energy. It's an unsettling, perpetual dusk, a world trapped in a state of extended, suffocating twilight. This wasn't a temporary eclipse, a passing cloud, or a localized hazy day. This terrifying phenomenon, this relentless, oppressive darkness, clung to the earth for an agonizing 18 terrifying months. Some accounts suggest it persisted in some form for over 2 years. Contemporary chroniclers, meticulously recording the events of their time from across vast geographical distances, from the sophisticated, well-documented courts of Constantinople and Rome, to the isolated monastic scriptoria of Ireland and the highly organized imperial archives of China, all independently documented this horrifying, unprecedented shift in the heavens. The renowned Byzantine historian Procopius, writing from the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire and a first-hand witness to these horrors, vividly described it. For the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during this whole year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in a lunar eclipse. For the beams it shed were not clear, nor such as it is accustomed to shed. Imagine the terror in his words, the sheer bewilderment, the profound sense of cosmic wrongness. Irish annals, terse and stark monastic records of events, spoke chillingly of a failure of bread from the year 536 to 539, a direct and devastating consequence of the sun's failure. Far across the globe, official Chinese historical records from the Wei dynasty describe yellow dust rain down like snow, clearly indicating a singular, massive, and global atmospheric event. These independent accounts, separated by thousands of miles and vastly different cultures, paint a chillingly consistent, terrifying picture of a world suddenly plunged into an extended, unnatural twilight. The uniformity of these global observations underscores the sheer magnitude of whatever catastrophe had unfolded. For centuries, the precise cause of this apocalyptic gloom remained a profound mystery, a frustratingly vague blip in the grand tapestry of the historical record, often attributed simplistically to God's wrath, a malevolent shift in the cosmos, or some dark, inexplicable omen. But modern science, armed with sophisticated tools and interdisciplinary research, has finally given us the terrifying answer: a massive cataclysmic volcanic eruption. And not just any eruption, but one of the largest and most devastating volcanic events in the last 2,000 years. Scientific analysis of ultra-fine ash layers and other geological markers, preserved deep within ancient ice core samples extracted from glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica, has pinpointed the culprit, a colossal eruption, most likely originating in Iceland, with strong evidence suggesting it was compounded by another significant eruption around 540 AD, possibly from a different location, like North America or Indonesia. This colossal event, or more likely a series of closely timed events, didn't just spew a little ash, it injected immense quantities of fine volcanic dust, sulfur aerosols, and other particulate matter high into the stratosphere, forming a vast, dense, sun-blotting veil that literally enveloped the entire northern hemisphere, and possibly even the entire globe, for an agonizing year and a half, and its effects lingered for over a decade. The sheer volume of material ejected was unprecedented in recent human history. The immediate and devastating consequences were not slow to manifest. They were immediate and catastrophic. That dense dust veil didn't just dim the sun, it acted like a giant, global dimmer switch, dramatically and consistently lowering global temperatures. This wasn't merely a chilly winter that ended in spring. This was a sudden, unprecedented global cooling event, plunging the northern hemisphere and potentially parts of the southern hemisphere into what scientists now chillingly refer to as a late antique Little Ice Age. Summer, as people had known and relied upon it for millennia for crop growth, simply ceased to exist. Temperatures dropped by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius on average, a seemingly small number that over an entire year and across vast regions spells doom. Tree rings from across continents, Europe, Asia, North and South America, show a dramatic and sudden halt in their growth around 536 AD, often recording the narrowest rings in centuries, unequivocally indicating that vital growing seasons effectively vanished. Imagine the collective horror as farmers, whose entire lives, economies, and very survival revolved around the predictable rhythms of the seasons and the certainty of a harvest, watched their fields yield nothing but withered stalks and barren earth. Now truly consider what this means for a world almost entirely dependent on local agriculture, living hand to mouth, with no modern supply chains, no refrigerated trucks transporting goods across continents, no massive silos of grain, no imported produce from the other side of the planet. The ground, once fertile and yielding, hardened, became infertile, and utterly refused to give forth sustenance. The air, once mild and life-sustaining, turned bitterly cold, even in peak summer months, bringing unseasonal frosts and freezes that killed any nascent sprouts, any desperate attempts at planting. Crops failed, universally and completely. Wheat, barley, oats, the very staples of life, the foundational caloric intake for the vast majority of the population, withered and died in the fields. Vineyards produced no grapes for wine, a key source of calories and comfort. Fruit trees remained barren. The harvest was gone, not just for a season, but for years, impacting multiple successive harvests. This wasn't localized crop failure due to bad luck or a single poor farmer's misjudgment. This was a global, pervasive agricultural collapse on an unprecedented and terrifying scale, which, inevitably, brings us to the next, more terrifying horror: widespread famine. Without crops, there was no food, and without food, people starved. This wasn't localized hunger, a problem for only the poorest segments of society. This was an all-encompassing, democratic starvation, affecting entire populations, from the lowest peasants to the highest nobility. The famine was so severe and widespread that desperate people resorted to truly unthinkable measures. While concrete accounts are often vague or shrouded in euphemism due to the unspeakable nature of the acts, historical records from across Europe and Asia speak of widespread death from hunger, of people consuming anything they could find. Tree bark stripped from forests, wild roots, desperate scavenged carrion, anything to try and survive. There are even horrifying, if generalized, reports of cannibalism emerging from the most desperate regions. The weak, the old, the very young. They died first, their bodies wasting away into skeletal forms, their eyes haunted by an endless hunger. Death became an ever-present silent companion, not from plague or war yet, but from the gnawing, relentless, agonizing pain of hunger. Imagine the constant physical gnawing pain of hunger in your own stomach, the piercing, heartbreaking screams of starving children, the hollow, skeletal faces of your neighbors, the silent, crushing despair as you watch your own family waste away before your eyes, knowing with absolute certainty that there is simply no food to be found anywhere, for anyone, and no hope of a harvest to come. What part of that slow, agonizing starvation do you think you'd break from first? The constant physical gnawing pain in your stomach, the profound helplessness, or the soul-crushing despair of watching your loved ones suffer and die, knowing you are powerless to help them? Let me know in the comments below. Beyond the immediate, visceral terror of starvation, the very economic foundations of society crumbled. Trade routes, already precarious and dependent on stable societies and reliable production, ground to a complete halt. What was there to trade when no one had food? What value did luxury goods, or even basic tools, hold when simple survival consumed every thought? Markets emptied, silent and desolate, the bustling heart of any town now a graveyard of commerce. Money, once the lifeblood of exchange, became worthless because there was nothing to buy, nothing to sell, nowhere to spend it. Bartering, if anything, would have taken over, but with so little surplus, even that would have been difficult. Governments, already struggling with the immense loss of tax revenue from failing harvests and dying populations, found themselves utterly unable to feed their armies, pay their officials, or maintain even the most basic public order. This widespread economic collapse directly led to a rampant breakdown of social order. Lawlessness surged, not just from professional criminals, but from desperate, starving people driven to acts they would never have contemplated before. Banditry became commonplace on roads and in once safe countrysides, with armed groups preying on the even more desperate. Villages were abandoned en masse as people fled their dying communities in futile searches for food, becoming displaced refugees in their own lands. Rootless and vulnerable, these desperate migrations often led to further violence, exposure, disease, or a lonely death on their arduous, hopeless journeys. In the mighty Byzantine Empire, ruled by the ambitious and powerful Emperor Justinian I, one of history's most renowned and dominant leaders, the darkness of 536 was a profound and brutal shock. Justinian was in the midst of his grand dream to rebuild the glorious Roman Empire, reconquering lost territories, reforming laws, and building magnificent architectural marvels like the Hagia Sophia, which still stands as a testament to his ambition. But this unprecedented environmental catastrophe crippled his ambitions and brought his grand designs to a shuddering halt. His vast armies, already stretched thin across multiple fronts, were weakened by hunger and rampant disease. They found it increasingly difficult to campaign, suffering massive desertions, an inability to be provisioned, and a general lack of morale. His imperial treasury, once flush with the spoils of conquest and taxes from a productive agrarian economy, rapidly depleted as the economy collapsed, and tax collection became impossible. The environmental shock of 536 AD weakened his mighty empire at its core, from the top leadership down to the individual soldier and peasant, leaving it dangerously vulnerable to the next, even greater catastrophe that lay just around the corner. And here's precisely where 536 AD wasn't just a bad year, but arguably the worst single year in recorded history, because it didn't come alone. It was not an isolated incident of mass death or destruction, a one-off disaster from which humanity could recover. Rather, it was the catastrophic precursor, the terrifying opening act for an even more terrifying, global horror that would define the era and shape the subsequent centuries. The widespread famine that followed, the drastically weakened immune systems of a malnourished populace, and the mass displacement of millions of people created the perfect, terrifying crucible for the emergence and explosive spread of the Justinianic plague. This wasn't some isolated local epidemic contained to a single city. This was the first fully documented pandemic of Yersinia pestis, the exact same bacterium that would later cause the infamous Black Death. Centuries later, but it arrived at a moment of unparalleled global vulnerability. The plague erupted in 541 AD, a mere 5 years after the sun first dimmed, but it exploded across the weakened, disorganized, and malnourished populations that 536 had already decimated. It swept through cities and countrysides with terrifying speed and lethality, leaving mounds of unburied corpses in the streets, infecting anyone and everyone, without distinction of wealth, status, or piety. The symptoms were horrific, massive, painful, swollen buboes, lymph nodes, raging fever, excruciating muscle pain, delirium, and often rapid, agonizing death within days of infection. It utterly crippled urban centers, where populations were dense and vulnerability was highest, and then spread along trade routes that were already faltering from the environmental disaster. The Justinianic plague ultimately wiped out an estimated 25 to 50 million people, potentially half of the entire world's population at the time, particularly devastating the Mediterranean basin, Europe, parts of Asia, and North Africa. It brought the once mighty Byzantine Empire to its knees, halting its military expansion, decimating its tax base, and ending Justinian's grand dreams of a fully restored Roman Empire. It literally emptied cities and fundamentally reshaped the demographic landscape of the ancient world, ushering in what many historians truly call the bleakest period of the Dark Ages for Europe. The year 536 didn't just bring darkness and hunger, it paved the way, it laid the groundwork, it created the perfect, horrifying conditions for the single deadliest biological event the world had ever seen, up to that point. It created a world of chronic vulnerability, where the plague would continue to resurface in waves for the next 2 centuries, preventing true societal recovery and progress. So while other years like 1347, the peak of the Black Death, or 1918, the Spanish flu pandemic, brought immense horrifying death tolls from a single acute event, 536 was unique in its insidious cruelty and long-term consequences. It wasn't a singular, acute event of mass casualties from a disease or a war. Instead, it was a foundational, global, and prolonged environmental catastrophe that set the stage for everything that followed. It systematically weakened humanity from its core, stripped societies bare of their resources, and made them utterly vulnerable to the next, even more destructive wave of death and despair. It was the year the world went dark, literally and figuratively, robbing humanity of its resilience, its food, its health, its social structures, and its very hope, just before the greatest biological terror descended. Its direct and indirect effects reverberated for decades, even centuries, fundamentally shaping the course of empires and human development, leading to widespread depopulation that would take hundreds of years to fully recover from. The impact was so profound that it led to long-term climate shifts, agricultural changes, and altered migration patterns for entire civilizations. Imagine, for a moment, the sheer psychological toll of living through such a period. You're not just perpetually hungry, your body racked with pain. You genuinely believe the gods have abandoned you, or that the world itself is truly ending. The sun, the very source of all life, warmth and predictability, is sickly and pale, a malevolent, impotent eye in a perpetual gloom. The world is ending, not with a sudden cataclysm of fire, but with a slow, agonizing descent into bone-chilling cold, pervasive hunger that never ends, and unimaginable, soul-crushing despair. How do you maintain your sanity when every day is a desperate, brutal struggle to find a mere morsel of food, and you watch your children, your parents, your neighbors slowly waste away before your eyes, their bodies becoming mere husks, when the very act of growing food, the basis of human civilization for millennia, has been utterly stolen by an invisible, suffocating shroud in the sky? The constant gnawing uncertainty, the pervasive sense of dread, the feeling of being utterly abandoned by the heavens themselves, these would have been as crushing as the physical hardships. Historical accounts, though scarce, hint at soaring rates of suicide and infanticide in sheer desperation. Faith would have been both a desperate lifeline and a source of profound terror, as every disaster was interpreted as immediate, divine punishment for unconfessed sins. Life became a living purgatory, a test of endurance against overwhelming cosmic forces. What specific kind of hardship or societal collapse do you think would crush your modern spirit first? The endless, brutal toil for meager scraps, knowing it might not even be enough to survive the next day. The constant, overwhelming fear of banditry and violence in a lawless world where might makes right and survival is everything. Or the suffocating, soul-crushing lack of hope and the terrifying spiritual belief that the very heavens had turned irrevocably against humanity, plunging you into an eternal darkness from which there is no escape. Drop your thoughts in the comments. The year 536 AD wasn't just a bad year. It was a brutal, relentless cascade of horrors initiated by a single terrifying environmental event. It reshaped the course of history, not through conquest or grand political shifts, but through the fundamental destruction of the world's climate and the human populations it supported. It stands as a stark, humbling reminder of humanity's profound fragility in the face of nature's raw, unpredictable power. It serves as a chilling testament to how interconnected our world is with the natural environment, and how quickly civilization, even mighty empires, can unravel when those essential connections are severed. It's a year that demands our remembrance, not just for its devastation, but for the profound lessons it offers about resilience, vulnerability, and the intricate dance between human civilization and the planet we inhabit. If learning about the almost unimaginable horrors of 536 AD made you appreciate your climate-controlled home, your reliably stocked fridge, or just the comforting, consistent glow of the sun in the sky, then please hit that like button and subscribe. Your engagement helps us keep unearthing these often uncomfortable truths from history, allowing us to learn from the past and, perhaps, appreciate the present just a little bit more. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next forgotten story. Hey guys, tonight we're ripping open a chapter of history that's usually kept under lock and key, whispered about in hushed tones, or simply ignored. We're talking about lust, love, and sin in the Middle Ages, a topic bursting with hypocrisy, hidden passions, and surprisingly modern struggles. Forget the valiant knights and the demure damsels for a moment. This journey isn't about romanticized ideals, it's about the raw, visceral realities of human desire, clashing head-on with rigid religious dogma. And let me tell you, if you lived back then with anything resembling a modern libido, a curious mind, or even a hint of adventurous spirit, chances are you'd find yourself in the stocks publicly shamed, or facing far, far worse. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely want to keep uncovering these uncomfortable truths. And as always, I'm curious, where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Now dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that soft, almost conspiratorial hum, and let's plunge into the untold story of medieval desire. Before we descend into this often uncomfortable truth, tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? Are you nestled in a cozy modern home, perhaps enduring a long commute, or simply seeking a moment of quiet reflection, hidden from the general chaos of life? Drop a comment below and let me know your location and the time. And if this kind of unvarnished storytelling brings you even a sliver of peace, or at least keeps you from the endless scroll of modern anxieties, then a quick like and subscribe would be deeply appreciated. It's oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to the same slow march through history. The walled-in world, monastic life, and forbidden desires. Our pilgrimage into medieval sexuality doesn't begin in a bustling marketplace or a sultry tavern. No, we're starting in the most unexpected place, behind the thick, cold stone walls of a medieval monastery or convent. The air here smells of damp stone, old parchment, and overpowering piety. It's quiet, unnervingly so, the kind of silence that makes your own heartbeat feel like a drum, echoing the constant inner battle fought by those who dwelled within. Monks and nuns, cloistered away from the wickedness of the secular world, took solemn vows, poverty, obedience, and most crucially for our topic tonight, chastity. They renounced the flesh, dedicated their lives entirely to God. Lust, within these hallowed walls, was the ultimate enemy, a prowling beast waiting to snatch your soul and damn it to eternal hellfire. And yet, if the confessionals and private writings of the time are to be believed, this beast visited surprisingly often and with relentless, terrifying persistence. Imagine Brother Thomas, hunched over a heavy, illuminated manuscript, painstakingly copying Latin scriptures, his mind ostensibly on divine matters. But then, Sister Agnes, her wool habit rustling softly, glides past the entrance to the scriptorium. For a split second, his fingers twitch, his gaze flickers, momentarily caught in her subtle grace. He clutches his worn rosary, tighter than strictly necessary, trying to banish the impure thought, to wrestle his mind back to the sacred text. This wasn't just a fleeting temptation, it was a daily, hourly, moment-by-moment struggle. Medieval monastic life, ironically designed to suppress carnal desire, often became an intense, psychological pressure cooker of unspoken longings and forbidden fantasies. Confessionals across Europe brimmed with agonizingly awkward confessions, slippery accidents, dreams that left garments stained, often interpreted as nocturnal emissions, but nonetheless a source of immense guilt, or private moments with saintly statues that, when later recounted, revealed unsettling, almost erotic undertones. The historical records from this period, meticulously kept by the very institutions trying to suppress these urges, are incredibly, sometimes hilariously, honest. Take the infamous case of a 12th century abbot who confessed that the devil would torment him with vivid visions of naked women, not in his sleep, not in a dark alley, but right there in church, during solemn prayer, no less. Did they tempt him? Absolutely. He once described being so tormented that he literally rammed his face into the cold stone floor, hoping the physical pain and humiliation would banish the impure thoughts. It didn't work. The irony is excruciating. Monastic life was pitched as the ultimate escape from sin and worldly temptations. Take vows, eat bland food, chant Latin all day, shave your head. But as countless monks and nuns discovered, isolation, combined with the extreme, almost impossible pressure of achieving total purity, often only intensified forbidden thoughts and desires. It was, in essence, an erotic pressure cooker, building up steam with nowhere to vent. And don't think women were exempt. Nuns, too, documented their struggles, sometimes in veiled metaphors, sometimes with a startling, heartbreaking frankness. A 14th century nun recounts terrifying nightmares of being seduced by black beasts with burning breaths, classic incubus imagery, the male demon believed to sexually assault sleeping women. She wrote entire prayers, desperate, pleading pleas to God, begging him to harden her soul so she wouldn't, succumb to the demonic advances. Scholars still fiercely debate whether these visions were purely spiritual, psychological manifestations of intense internal conflict, or if these women were unknowingly channeling deeply suppressed desires into a language acceptable within their rigid religious framework. Was calling it a demon safer, more pious, and less damning than admitting, I'm experiencing intense forbidden desire and I hate myself for it. Almost certainly, some monks even resorted to bizarre, almost desperate measures like dream yoga, training themselves to lucidly recite psalms or prayers in their sleep to drown out any seductive thoughts or images. Desperate times indeed called for desperate and often strange measures. And then there's the inconvenient elephant in the cloister: actual affairs. Despite the ironclad vows, secret relationships flourished. Monastic archives contain evidence of smuggled love letters, forbidden nighttime visits facilitated by bribed guards, even hidden tunnels used to facilitate clandestine meetings between monks and nuns from separate quarters, or with individuals from outside the monastery walls. Shockingly, a significant number of monks and nuns were discovered to have had children. In some convents, pregnant nuns were quietly, discreetly sent away to repent, to endure their pregnancy in shame, and the child was either abandoned at a church doorstep or mysteriously adopted by local villagers. The official explanation often trotted out: miraculous conception, or more commonly, trickery by the devil. Sure, Jan, while not every soul succumbed, and many truly dedicated their lives to spiritual purity, the sheer volume of these illicit accounts across centuries suggests that even the most devout and isolated individuals couldn't entirely escape the inexorable pull of human desire. It's a profound testament to the enduring power of the flesh, even in the most sacred and supposedly insulated of spaces. So after learning about the intimate struggles of monks and nuns, what's the one modern luxury or freedom you'd struggle most to give up if you entered a medieval monastery today? Your personal space, your comfort food, or the freedom to pursue a relationship of your own choosing? Let us know your absolute breaking point in the comments below. The dance of deception, courtly love and its secrets. Now let's leave the hushed, often guilt-ridden confines of the monastery and gallop into a world draped in silk, where desire wears a mask of eloquent longing and elaborate ritual, the courts of courtly love. You arrive at a sprawling, sun-drenched castle, the stones warmed by the afternoon light, making everything look slightly more romantic than it probably was. The air hums with the pluck of lutes and the low, aching drone of romantic poetry. Welcome to the world of knights, ladies, and a peculiar, exquisitely painful game of emotional suffering. Here, desire isn't forbidden. In fact, it's passionately celebrated, but always in the most excruciatingly unattainable way. Picture this: a knight kneels before a noblewoman, clad in shimmering silks, his eyes smoldering with a manufactured intensity, his voice trembling as he vows eternal loyalty. He praises her eyes, her grace, the very way she glides across the hall, like a swan upon a lake, endless, flowery metaphors. She, in turn, accepts his devotion with just the right hint of elegant disinterest, a subtly raised eyebrow, a smile that could be interpreted as kindness, or, just as easily, cruelty. They exchange tokens, a perfumed glove, a silken scarf, sometimes a literal lock of hair, but if that knight believes this gesture gets him anywhere near her bedchambers, he is profoundly mistaken. This is courtly love, refined, tortured, and obsessively focused on the longing, the ideal, the love that absolutely cannot be, and perhaps should not be, consummated. It was the medieval art of seduction, without resolution, a constant state of romantic almost, forever on the precipice of fulfillment, but never quite tipping over. You might wonder, and many historians have, if this entire cultural phenomenon was the medieval version of edging, a deliberate, tantalizing postponement of gratification. The troubadours and trouveurs, the rock stars and pop idols of the age, traveled from court to court, weaving intricate tales and singing of unattainable women and the agonizing beauty of unfulfilled desire. Stories like those of Lancelot and Guinevere from Chrétien de Troyes became foundational blueprints for this romantic code, depicting a true love that was always just out of reach, always needing to be kept secret because one party was inevitably married to a king or a rival lord. And yes, while these stories were technically fiction, they profoundly shaped the actual behavior and social rituals of the nobility. People mimicked what they read and heard. Ladies would flirt just enough to inspire fervent devotion, but never so much as to compromise their carefully guarded reputations or lose control of the situation. Knights performed absurd, often dangerous feats, jousting in tournaments, embarking on perilous quests to slay mythical beasts, writing endless sonnets by flickering candlelight, all for a single fleeting smile or a whispered word of encouragement. The performance itself, the public display of wanting, was the reward. The underlying philosophy was that wanting, the yearning, was somehow nobler and purer than the messy reality of having. But here's the crucial kicker, the hidden truth beneath the glossy surface. These elaborate, chaste declarations were often just a thin, elegant cover for very real, very physical affairs, especially at court, where political marriages were the absolute norm. Love or lust often had to be found elsewhere, illicitly. You'd observe couples slipping away into side corridors, their masks of polite longing dropping the moment they were alone. The eloquent poetry would dissolve into hushed whispers, and noble restraint became a thinly veiled excuse to sneak off behind a convenient tapestry or into a secluded garden pavilion. One particularly juicy historical example involves Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, who famously hosted courts of love, where ladies debated intricate rules of romantic behavior like it was a medieval episode of The Bachelor. Should a man pursue a married woman? Should jealousy be encouraged? How do you truly test a lover's loyalty? It all sounds terribly polite and philosophical until you realize many of the participants in these very debates were embroiled in clandestine affairs of their own, often with the very knights who were penning those swoony, chaste poems. Despite the widespread clandestine reality, courtly love theoretically adhered to strict rules. The most significant one was that it was supposed to be non-physical. This crucial distinction kept it from being technically sinful in the eyes of the church. The church, predictably, wasn't entirely thrilled with courtly love, seeing it as suspiciously secular, focusing too much on earthly desire rather than divine love. Yet it was hard to outright condemn someone for simply saying they admired another person's soul, especially when the admiration came wrapped in such beautiful, soaring metaphors. But the lines, as always with human desire, blurred constantly. You might stumble upon the story of a nobleman who, to prove his unyielding devotion to a lady who had refused him, dramatically cut himself with a dagger. She, moved by his extreme gesture, agreed to a secret meeting. You'd think this is where things finally got physical, but no, they simply talked. She told him he'd earned her heart, and he promised to serve her until his death. That was it. Everyone, including you, would walk away utterly disappointed by the lack of dramatic conclusion. And yet these relationships, whether pure or illicit, carried immense social and political weight. A single flirtation could destroy reputations, shatter marriages, and even spark wars. Kings grew violently jealous, queens retaliated with cunning cleverness, and knights sometimes switched allegiances based on perceived slights or favors. You'd watch it unfold in slow motion, the way a lingering look became a whisper, and a whisper metastasized into a damning rumor, which then exploded into a full-blown scandal. As one lady of the court, perhaps with a cynical glint in her eye, might have murmured to you, "It's not the love that's dangerous, it's the politics," she wouldn't be wrong. There's even a fascinating fringe theory among some scholars that courtly love was actually a kind of literary smokescreen for real-world power negotiations. Noble women, so often mere pawns in arranged political marriages, cleverly used the rituals of courtly love to subtly assert influence. By choosing which knight to favor, which one to tease, or which one to publicly shame, they indirectly controlled social dynamics and alliances within the court. So perhaps that fluttering glove wasn't just a token of affection, it was a calculated chess move. And then finally, there's the actual sex, or the perceived lack of it. Some historians argue that courtly love was a kind of proto-erotic theatre, a sophisticated way to sublimate carnal desire into something socially acceptable and artistic. Others insist that sex did happen, it was just deeply hidden behind layers of metaphor and poetic euphemism, so thick that they could confuse any diligent medieval chaperone. After all, medieval texts rarely said things outright. Instead of they slept together, it was more likely he took shelter in her garden, or they shared a single star-dusted moment. Very subtle indeed. By the end of an evening spent observing these courtly rituals, you'd realize you've been watching an elaborate masquerade, everyone pretending to be above the flesh, while quietly, expertly negotiating access to it. Lust here wore a mask of longing, choreographed, constrained, and yet still somehow managing to burn through the silk and lace like wildfire. After witnessing the noble charade of courtly love, are you more surprised by its incredibly elaborate rules, or by the sheer volume of hidden affairs they tried so hard to conceal? Tell us your honest thoughts in the comments below. Earthy desires, peasant life and practical love. Now let's abruptly leave the glittering, deceptive world of the nobles behind. No more velvet drapes, no more lute music, no more fan dances of flirtation. Here, the air is heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and the unmistakable aroma of livestock. You're standing in the muddy, unpaved center of a typical medieval village, somewhere in northern Europe, perhaps England or France. The houses are cramped and clustered together, built of rough timber and thatch. There's no such thing as personal space, let alone privacy. But that, surprisingly, doesn't mean people here don't fall in love, or lust, or end up tangled in bedrolls on chilly nights. In fact, they often do, but without the luxury of silk bedsheets or carefully coded poetry. You duck beneath the low, rough-hewn doorway of a typical cottage. The interior is a single, dim, smoky room. One bed, maybe two if the family is exceptionally fortunate, shared by parents, multiple children, and sometimes even a goat or a pig during the colder months. Imagine the lack of privacy, the constant proximity, and this is precisely where necessity birthed ingenious, often surprising customs. In some regions, there was a widespread tradition called bundling, or bed courtship. This was a practice where a young couple, often in their teens, was allowed to lie together in bed, fully clothed, to talk, bond, and test their compatibility. Yes, you heard that right. In bed together, often with a literal wooden plank or a tightly packed sackcloth barrier placed between them down the middle of the mattress. The theoretical idea was that they wouldn't have sex, that they'd just, hang out in supervised intimacy. But let's be honest, they were teenagers, brimming with curiosity, often surrounded by soft hay in a dark room. You do the math. Unsurprisingly, this often led to what was rather charmingly called premarital negotiation. If a girl became pregnant, the community, which was both witness and judge, almost always expected the young man to marry her. Shotgun weddings weren't uncommon, and neither was the quiet, almost resigned acceptance that, hey, maybe that bundling board was more symbolic than truly effective. What might truly surprise you is how communal all this was. In a society where true personal privacy was almost non-existent, the entire village became both witness and arbiter of romantic relationships. Neighbors gossiped freely, families kept meticulous tabs, and public reputation could make or break a courtship, or even a marriage. You might even hear about a rather intrusive ritual where, after a wedding night, the elder women of the village would inspect the bed sheets to confirm consummation. If the sheet showed signs of blood, a sign of virginity lost, all was well, and the marriage was considered valid and complete. If not, rumors would fly, questioning the bride's purity or the groom's virility. You'd have to wonder how many clever brides discreetly pre-stained the fabric just to avoid such a public scandal. Sex among the peasantry wasn't shrouded in the same performative chastity as among the nobility. It was often practical, part of the cycle of life, sometimes tender, sometimes hurried, and often simply a means of procreation. You'd observe couples stealing moments of intimacy behind towering haystacks, or in the deep anonymity of the surrounding forest, where birdsong and the rustle of leaves provided the thinnest veil of cover. A few were caught, of course, but punishment was often lighter than you'd expect. A small fine, perhaps public penance for a minor transgression. Everyone knew, deep down, that desire didn't patiently wait for the church's official blessing. However, More serious transgressions, like adultery, especially if it involved someone of higher status, could still lead to severe consequences, exile, brutal flogging, or worse. But among the lower classes, sexual transgressions were often handled more pragmatically and within the tight-knit community itself. You might witness a charivari, a bizarre, noisy public shaming ritual. This would occur when a man married a much younger woman, or if someone was suspected of infidelity or other socially disruptive sexual behavior. The offender would be paraded through the village on a donkey, often backward, while an angry mob banged pots and pans, blew horns, and yelled insults. It was half punishment, half theatrical performance, reeking of petty vengeance disguised as moral outrage. Yet amidst the harshness, there was also an earthy humor and a kind of pragmatic acceptance. A local midwife, a stout woman with a gap-toothed smile and knowing eyes, might pull you aside and quietly joke about how many noblemen had left their blessings, euphemisms for illegitimate children, in village cradles. And yes, that was absolutely a thing. Powerful noblemen would sometimes use their power to take advantage of peasant girls, leading to awkwardly mixed status children who were often quietly absorbed into the village fabric, or, less fortunately, cast out. One thing that stands out is how informal marriage itself could be. While the church increasingly pushed for formal, priest-officiated ceremonies, in many rural areas, marriage could simply be a handshake in front of witnesses, a verbal agreement to share work, food, and a bed. This was known as hand-fasting, or spousal consent. If you lived together, if everyone recognized you as a couple, then that was that. It was marriage by consensus, surprisingly flexible until it wasn't. Of course, there was always someone watching from the margins. You might meet an old widow who whispers about woods women, young girls who disappeared into the forest to avoid public shame after an unplanned pregnancy, or who practiced their own kind of folk magic to control fertility. There were potent herbs passed in secret, teas brewed to bring on the moon, induce menstruation or abortion, and charms tied under skirts. Some of it was practical, some was pure superstition, but all of it revealed how desperately women tried to maintain a semblance of control in a world that often denied them agency over their own bodies and lives. And here's a truly quirky fact of the night you might stumble across. In some remote parts of medieval Europe, young couples who couldn't afford a priest blessing for their union would literally carve love runes or initials into tree bark, not just as a romantic gesture, but as a kind of spiritual insurance policy. If they couldn't get the church's blessing, the tree, ancient and eternal, would serve as their witness. It was natural, enduring, and frankly, far more accessible than a distant bishop. Scholars still argue fiercely about just how common sex before marriage was among peasants. Some point to church records full of fines and punishments, arguing that these show widespread deviance. Others counter that those records only capture the rare, egregious cases that caused public scandal. What's clear is that the strict rules on paper and the messy reality in the field rarely lined up perfectly. Desire finds cracks, it grows in the shadows, and in medieval villages, it shaped lives in ways that were often more honest, sometimes more humane, and always profoundly human. After considering how peasants navigated love and lust, what would be harder for you to endure? The complete lack of personal privacy, or the constant community oversight and judgment of your romantic life? Let us know your absolute breaking point in the comments below. The shadow of sin, church, punishment, and the demonic. Now, let's step into the daunting, all-encompassing shadow of the medieval church and its unyielding, often terrifying battle against sin. In medieval Europe, the church wasn't just a spiritual guide, it was the ultimate, inescapable authority, dictating everything from what you ate on Fridays, to whom you could marry, and most intimately, how and when you could express desire. Sex for the church was primarily for procreation within the sacred confines of marriage. Any deviation from this narrow path was considered a grievous sin, a direct affront to God, punishable both in this life and far more terrifyingly, in the eternal damnation of the next. Confession was paramount, a cornerstone of medieval spiritual life. You were expected, indeed required, to confess your sexual transgressions, often in excruciating, humiliating detail, to a priest. These confessionals, hidden behind wooden screens, became unintended, informal databanks on medieval sexuality for modern historians, revealing a vast, bewildering spectrum of what was deemed sinful: fornication, sex outside marriage, adultery, sex with a married person, homosexuality, often vaguely termed sodomy and deemed an unnatural vice, punishable with extreme cruelty, masturbation, the solitary vice, incest, bestiality, and even using any form of birth control, herbs, charms, or coitus interruptus to prevent conception within marriage was considered a sin against God's will to procreate. The punishments meted out by the church varied wildly, from long fasts and arduous pilgrimages to public penance, crippling fines, or even public flogging and excommunication, which was tantamount to social death. The pervasive fear of demon lovers like incubi and succubi was deeply rooted in this intense anxiety surrounding sexual sin outside sanctioned boundaries. If a person, particularly a vulnerable nun or a struggling monk, claimed to have been sexually assaulted by a demonic entity in their sleep, it was often genuinely believed to be a real occurrence, a physical manifestation of their own suppressed sinful desires, or even a literal terrifying attack from Satan himself. It provided a complex, albeit terrifying framework for discussing forbidden urges without directly admitting to them, a dangerous tightrope walk between piety, genuine psychological distress, and outright psychosis. The church even had specific rituals for exorcising such demonic possessions. The church's stringent rules inevitably led to a thriving, yet condemned, underground of sexual activity. Prostitution, though officially denounced as a grave sin, existed in almost every town, often confined to specific, segregated red light districts. While prostitutes were social outcasts relegated to the margins of society, they provided an undeniable outlet for men, and surprisingly, municipal authorities often tolerated or even regulated them for public order, and of course for tax revenue. Homosexuality, while an unspeakable sin in the eyes of the church and punishable with extreme brutality, often burning at the stake or castration for men, existed too, albeit in the deepest secrecy. Historical records, particularly court documents detailing accusations or trials, sometimes hint at or explicitly detail same-sex relationships, revealing the hidden lives of individuals who dared to defy societal and religious norms at immense personal risk. Even pilgrims, supposedly on a sacred journey of spiritual devotion, weren't immune to temptation. Many popular pilgrimage routes across Europe became sites of casual sexual encounters, with inns and taverns along the way, serving as informal brothels. The potent mix of anonymity, travel, the thrill of being away from local social oversight, and simply being human, often led to what some historians grimly call pilgrimage prostitution, a side economy fueled by lust and loosened morals on the path to piety. Then there's the more bizarre, almost desperate side of medieval desire, aphrodisiacs and love potions. People, driven by passion or desperation, concocted strange brews and charms from an astonishing array of ingredients, herbs, animal parts, like the dried blood of a bat or the heart of a dove, human remains, gruesome, I know, and other superstitious components. They genuinely believed these concoctions could ignite desire, compel someone to fall in love, or even magically bind a lover to them. These ranged from relatively harmless herbal infusions to truly dangerous mixtures that could cause illness or even death if ingested. Superstition, magic, and profound human desperation often went hand in hand in matters of the heart and loins. And what about sex during the greatest catastrophe of the Middle Ages, the Black Death, the plague, which wiped out an estimated 30 to 50% of Europe's population in just a few short years, profoundly altered societal attitudes towards life, death, and sex. Some reacted by becoming intensely religious, seeing the plague as God's divine punishment for rampant sin, leading to a temporary surge in piety and a crackdown on immoral behavior. Others swung wildly in the opposite direction, embracing a hedonistic live for today, for tomorrow we die mentality, leading to a shocking surge in revelry, excessive drinking, and indiscriminate promiscuity. The ever-present fear of imminent death ironically fueled a desperate, often reckless pursuit of earthly pleasure. Even clothing became a battleground of desire and moral policing. Sumptuary laws were enacted by both secular and religious authorities, attempting to regulate what people wore, specifically to prevent excessive or immodest displays that might incite lust or blur social distinctions. The length of sleeves, the depth of necklines, the richness of fabrics, the very colors worn, all were meticulously scrutinized and legislated. And of course, the infamous and largely mythical chastity belt remains a potent, if often exaggerated, symbol of medieval anxieties about female fidelity, though solid historical evidence of their widespread practical use is scant at best. They are more a product of later romantic fiction and artistic imagination than a common medieval reality. As you emerge from this immersive journey through medieval desire, you'll realize that while the rules were undeniably strict, human nature was, as ever, incredibly resilient, inventive, and resourceful. Lust, love, and sin weren't just abstract theological concepts. They were lived realities, messy, tender, shameful, sacred, and always just beneath the surface of official morality. The Middle Ages were never as clean, as cold, or as purely pious as textbooks often pretend. Desire has always pulsed through humanity, finding cracks in every wall, shaping lives in ways that were profoundly, brutally, and surprisingly human. If this deep dive into medieval desire made you question your perception of history, or perhaps appreciate the relative freedom of your own time, hit that like button, subscribe for more untold stories, and please share this video with someone who thinks they know everything about the past. Your engagement truly helps us keep unearthing these often uncomfortable truths, allowing us to learn from the past and perhaps appreciate the present just a little bit more. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next forgotten story. Many people look at the Middle Ages through incredibly romanticized eyes, conjuring idyllic images of valiant armored knights riding on lumbering steeds, their plumes fluttering in the breeze, or visions of beautiful damsels adorned in elaborate pointy hats, gracefully awaiting rescue. They dream of dragons soaring over fairy tale castles, of the purity of chivalry and the tender whispers of courtly love, all set against a backdrop of pristine, untouched wilderness. But for the vast majority of those who lived through this epoch, nothing, absolutely nothing, could be further from the harsh, undeniable truth. For most people, the Middle Ages were a stark, relentless existence defined by pervasive dirt, unimaginable difficulty, and omnipresent danger. It was a time when the very act of staying alive and striving for prosperity was a rare, fleeting luxury, and death, often in its most brutal and swift forms, lurked around every corner, ready to claim its next victim. Before we descend into this often uncomfortable truth, tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? Are you nestled in a cozy modern home, perhaps enduring a long commute, or simply seeking a moment of quiet reflection, hidden from the general chaos of life, safe in your climate-controlled bubble? Drop a comment below and let me know your location and the time, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Your engagement truly helps us continue to unearth these often forgotten stories. Alright, let's rip you from your cushioned existence, away from your filtered, purified water, your meticulously stocked refrigerator, and your climate-controlled sanctuary. Let's hurl you, headfirst, into the perpetually damp, disease-ridden, and relentlessly unsanitary reality of a European village in the 14th century. Precisely at the moment, the bell in the distant, dilapidated church begins its merciless, unyielding toll, signaling dawn. Welcome to the Dark Ages. You wouldn't last 24 hours. Your first awakening isn't to the gentle hum of your heating system, the soothing warmth of a memory foam mattress, or the inviting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. No, instead, you're jarred awake by the biting, pervasive cold that seems to seep into your very bones, even under your rough, itchy wool blanket, which is likely stuffed with straw or animal hair. This isn't just a chill, it's a deep, penetrating cold that never truly leaves you, a constant companion from autumn through spring. The air is thick with the acrid stench of damp wood smoke from a nearby hearth, a stinging haze that perpetually irritates your lungs and eyes, mingled with the pervasive odor of unwashed bodies, both human and animal, and the undeniable tang of animal waste mixed with human refuse. As you stir, you'll immediately discover your new, unwelcome roommates. Fleas will be biting incessantly, their tiny, irritating pinpricks a constant torment beneath your clothing. Lice will be crawling on your scalp, an incessant itch that drives you to scratch almost involuntarily, and you'll likely hear the unsettling scuttling of rats across the packed earthen floor, perhaps even catching a glimpse of their beady eyes in the gloom, their presence a constant reminder of disease and decay. Houses weren't exactly palatial either. Most consisted of just one or two small, cramped rooms, often lacking a chimney, allowing smoke to fill the living space, and perhaps offering only one or two small, unglazed window openings that did little to ward off the elements. They were perpetually dark, suffocatingly smoky, reeked constantly, and were incredibly unsanitary because they were frequently shared with livestock, especially during the harsh, unforgiving winter months, when conditions outdoors were simply unbearable. With no central heating, no dependable lighting, beyond a sputtering tallow candle that cast more shadows than light, and certainly no running water, it's truly no wonder that medieval lives were tragically short. The very air you breathe is a noxious cocktail of smoke from open hearths, often burning damp wood or peat, which produces even more smoke, coupled with the unavoidable human and animal effluvium, and a pervasive, bone-chilling dampness that clings to everything. This isn't just unpleasant, it's a relentless assault on your respiratory system, making every breath you take scrape your throat, leaving it raw and irritated, and your eyes will constantly sting from the smoke and general irritation, often leading to chronic infections. Thirsty? That murky, stagnant, untreated well water is your only option. If you're lucky, it comes from a shallow well. If not, it's drawn directly from a river or stream that also serves as a dumping ground for human and animal waste, or collected as rainwater from lead-tainted roofs, providing an unseen, insidious poison. Drink up, if you dare risk the instant onset of debilitating dysentery, agonizing typhoid, relentless giardia, deadly cholera, or any number of other delightful, life-threatening waterborne parasites and infections that could fell you within hours. Forget the concept of daily showers, scented soaps, or even basic sanitation beyond a quick rinse in icy water or a rub with rough cloth. You'll quickly find yourself coated in an unyielding, oppressive layer of grime, sweat, and animal dander that will cling to your skin and clothing. Bathing was a rare and often communal affair, if it happened at all, perhaps a few times a year for the most fastidious, and soap as we know it, with its cleansing properties, was a distant dream. Flies, drawn by the omnipresent filth, the mountains of refuse, and the rotting organic matter that littered streets and homes, will be your constant buzzing companions. They will land on your meager food, crawl across your face, and relentlessly irritate any open sores you might have, acting as vectors for countless diseases. And yes, you will have open sores, because even minor cuts and scrapes, inevitable from the demanding manual labor, inevitably fester without any form of antiseptic or basic medical care. Your skin will itch incessantly from the filth and parasites, a maddening torment that will make sleep a fleeting luxury. The streets themselves are open sewers, a putrid mix of human and animal excrement, rotting food scraps, and general garbage, ensuring the spread of disease is constant and pervasive. Just picturing that first wave of stench, the biting cold, and the relentless assault of insects. What's the very first modern hygiene product or essential service you would truly, utterly despair for, the one that would break your spirit the quickest? Tell us in the comments and be excruciatingly specific about your sudden, profound craving. Breakfast is likely a thin gruel, a monotonous concoction, or a piece of hard, gritty bread, likely made from barley, oats, rye, or millet. This bread often contained ground stone fragments from crude milling processes, making every bite a painful assault on your teeth, leading to rapid wear, chips, and breaks. Meat is a profound luxury for most, a rare feast reserved for special occasions, if at all. Your diet will be relentlessly monotonous, severely nutrient poor, lacking essential vitamins and minerals, and frequently contaminated with dirt, insects, or mold. Your teeth? Prepare for widespread cavities, agonizing abscesses, and premature loss, with absolutely no hope of a dentist to alleviate your suffering, only agonizing pain and eventual tooth decay. Even if you were fortunate enough to be wealthy during the Middle Ages, affording the finer things in life, your chances of survival weren't necessarily guaranteed. While your table might be laden with meats like venison or peacock in rich cream sauces, followed by sugar desserts and fine wine, and you'd eat from beautifully glazed plates and drink from delicately decorated cups, these luxuries harbored a sinister secret. The elegant glazing was typically made from lead oxide. While it looked lovely and was practical for cleaning, when salty or acidic food was served on these glazed plates or kept in glazed pots for cooking, the coating would dissolve and the lead would be absorbed directly into your food. Lead is a highly poisonous heavy metal that accumulates silently in the human body over time, slowly poisoning you from the inside out. Acute poisoning could viciously attack the nervous system, causing debilitating headaches, agonizing abdominal pain, and infertility. Chronic poisoning could lead to terrifying seizures, debilitating mental decline, coma, and ultimately, a slow, painful death. For children whose bodies are still developing, the effects were even more devastating, severely impacting their cognitive development and overall ability to learn and thrive. Medieval skeletons exhumed from cemeteries in more affluent urban areas of Germany and Denmark have shockingly revealed lead levels well above what we consider normal today, indicating widespread exposure even among the privileged classes. Lead was also present in stained glass windows, coins, and on roof tiles, with rainwater collected from roofs for drinking, often becoming another insidious source of poisoning. Beyond lead, bread, the main food staple for medieval people, carried another deadly threat. Often, the rye used to make bread would become infected with a parasitic fungus called Claviceps purpura. This fungus caused an infection in humans known as St. Anthony's fire, or ergot poisoning. There were numerous outbreaks throughout the Middle Ages, which caused tens of thousands of people to die and millions more to become chronically sick. What we now know as ergot poisoning caused terrifying hallucinations, agonizing muscle cramps, persistent nausea, debilitating insomnia, and painful sores that would refuse to heal. In extreme cases, when left untreated, the blood flow to an infected person's hands and feet would be severely restricted, causing intense burning pains, leading to gangrene, where fingers, toes, hands, and feet could turn black, shrivel, and literally drop off, leaving a person permanently disfigured and disabled. Some historians even believe it was ergot poisoning that was responsible for some of the horrifying dancing epidemics that occurred between the 14th and 17th centuries, involving groups of people, sometimes thousands at a time, dancing erratically and uncontrollably in the streets until they collapsed from sheer exhaustion, injury, or even death. Imagine such a horrifying, uncontrollable madness. Every single meal you consumed was the direct result of relentless, back-breaking physical labor. A bad harvest, a sudden devastating flood, or an unusually brutal winter meant immediate and widespread starvation. Famine was not a distant threat, but a constant, looming shadow, never far away, shaping every decision and instilling a deep-seated fear. Malnutrition, endemic among the peasantry due to a monotonous diet of gruel and coarse bread, inevitably led to a severely weakened immune system, which in turn caused a surge in deadly diseases like dysentery, typhus, and smallpox, wiping out entire villages. The constant struggle for food meant that every calorie expended had to yield a return, making leisure a luxury few could afford. Step outside your meager dwelling, and you face dangers far beyond inconvenient traffic jams or a delayed bus. The wilderness was truly wild. Wolves, bears, and wild boars roamed the dense forests surrounding settlements, viewing humans and their precious livestock as just another potential meal. Even travel between villages, a journey of mere miles, was a perilous undertaking through untamed wilderness, where you were always on the menu for something bigger, hungrier, and far more vicious than yourself. Medieval Europe was teeming with wild game like rabbit, hare, deer, and boar, but these were exclusively for the nobility to hunt, a sport for the privileged, not a source of sustenance for the struggling lower classes. The penalty for poaching, for even daring to try and feed your starving family by hunting forbidden game, was usually swift and brutally harsh, often involving mutilation or death, making the choice between starvation and severe punishment a daily dilemma. After that first mouthful of gritty, dirt-laced bread and the constant threat of parasite-laden water, what's the one specific thing from your modern diet, or your modern safety regulations, or even just a common modern animal that you'd instantly sell your soul to have back? Tell us your most profound, desperate craving in the comments, and don't hold back on the details. Let's just suppose you suddenly found yourself arrived in medieval England, a victim of some inexplicable time slip, now completely stranded in the middle of the 14th century. The very first thing you would realize, with a crushing sense of isolation, is that you wouldn't understand a damn thing anybody was saying. The ordinary people spoke Middle English, a language vastly different from modern English, filled with unfamiliar vocabulary, complex grammatical structures, and regional pronunciations that would render casual conversation utterly unintelligible. Simple requests or questions would be met with blank stares. The posh aristocratic people, descendants of the Norman conquerors, spoke French, a language that signified their status and power, creating yet another linguistic barrier. And the clergy, the educated elite, who held immense power over daily life, spoke Church Latin, a dead language to all but the learned. Speaking only modern English, you might be able to pick up the odd recognizable word here and there, a mere glimmer of familiarity in a sea of alien sounds, but an intelligent, meaningful conversation with anybody would be an impossible feat at this point. Every interaction would be a frustrating pantomime, leaving you isolated, misunderstood, and profoundly vulnerable in a world where communication was paramount for survival. Beyond the linguistic chasm, your life would be relentlessly defined by endless, back-breaking physical labor from dawn till dusk, every single day. Your hands, accustomed to keyboards and soft fabrics, would quickly be calloused, blistered, and cracked, often bleeding from the constant friction and harsh elements. Your muscles would ache perpetually, a dull throb that never subsides. Ploughing fields with oxen, a slow and grueling process that demanded immense strength. Sowing seeds by hand, a meticulous yet physically taxing task. Meticulously weeding vast plots under the unforgiving sun or biting wind. Harvesting crops with crude scythes, requiring precision and endurance. Threshing grain, a repetitive and dusty ordeal. Hauling heavy buckets of water from a distant well, often multiple times a day. Chopping and stacking endless piles of wood for fuel, a year-round necessity. And tending to the meager livestock, ensuring their survival to ensure your body, accustomed to modern comforts and conveniences, would literally break within weeks. There are no such concepts as weekends, no paid sick days, no retirement plans, no social security net to cushion your falls. You simply work until you physically can't anymore, or until the harshest weather conditions bring all activity to a standstill, leaving you to endure the cold and hunger with no respite. The grim reality is that 85% of the population in the Middle Ages were serfs. This means you would almost certainly be part of that vast, subjugated group, irrevocably tied to the lord and his land, much like a piece of property. Not only would you have to labor ceaselessly to grow enough food to sustain yourself and your family, but you would also be obligated to ensure there was ample surplus to pay the lord his due, whether in crops, goods, or labor, often taking the best of your harvest. You couldn't leave the land without your lord's explicit permission, nor could you even get married without his consent, as he saw your potential children as future laborers for his estate. In essence, you may as well have been a slave, living under the constant, arbitrary whims of your master, with no legal recourse or appeal. Your existence would be perpetually reliant on the unpredictable weather. Too much rain, or not enough, could cause a catastrophic failure of crops, leading directly to widespread malnutrition, and in the worst cases, mass starvation for your entire community. Privacy, as we understand it, was an utterly alien concept, as multiple generations of a family would typically share a single, cramped room, often with their animals during colder months, further intensifying the sense of a suffocating lack of personal space and constant intrusion. And what if you were unlucky enough to be a woman in this era? Then you would truly know the meaning of hardship, a life of relentless duty and profound vulnerability. Because of the immense importance placed on biblical texts and their interpretations by the church, medieval women were commonly regarded as morally weak, inherently flawed, and perpetually susceptible to sin, a legacy of Eve. This perception led directly to their widespread oppression and treatment as subservient beings, secondary to men, in almost every aspect of life. In particular, the writings of St. Paul were frequently highlighted to justify men's absolute authority over women, emphasizing their need to remain silent in church, and crucially, to always be under the complete control and dominion of their husbands. For the peasant woman, work was rigidly gendered, demanding an exhausting double burden that left little room for rest. She was solely responsible for the vast array of arduous household chores, not only spinning thread for cloth, brewing ale for the family's consumption, cooking meager meals over an open fire, weaving fabric on a primitive loom, and meticulously taking care of the livestock and children, but also sharing the physically demanding labor of the farm and fieldwork alongside the men. Women were generally expected to fulfill one of two life paths: marry or become a nun. It was the first option, marriage, that awaited the vast majority of women, and it was a path fraught with peril. Marriage, almost inevitably, meant pregnancy, and pregnancy meant childbirth, a terrifying ordeal with no modern pain relief, no sterile hospital setting, and no trained medical professionals to assist beyond perhaps a local midwife. Complications that we now consider minor or inconsequential could prove devastatingly fatal for both the medieval mother and her child. Even having money and status offered no guarantee of a safe birth. A caesarean section, for instance, was only performed if the mother was already dying, or more commonly, already dead, simply to save the infant. In 1420s Florence, for a stark and horrifying example, a terrifying 1 in 5 women died during labor, a statistic that underscores the immense risk of simply bringing new life into the world. Death during childbirth was so prevalent, so expected, that women were routinely urged to write out a last will and testament long before giving birth, a grim, heartbreaking practice that certainly takes the shine off what should have been a joyous, hopeful event, transforming it into a moment of profound dread. What kind of physical labor or social restriction do you think would completely shatter your modern spirit first? The endless, brutal toil, the constant fear of your lord's whip, or the absolute suffocating lack of personal freedom and privacy in your daily existence? Share your true, raw breaking point in the comments. Today, we consider the death of a child to be a rare and utterly unexpected tragedy, an anomaly that shocks us to our core. But if you were born in the Middle Ages, you would be incredibly lucky to even make it past your 5th birthday. This is because the child mortality rate was astronomically high, a devastating reality for every family. In medieval England, a staggering 1/3 of all children died before reaching that tender age. The dangers would begin even whilst you were still in the womb. Unaware of the profound risks of alcohol-fetal syndrome, medieval women would have been blissfully knocking back huge quantities of ale or wine or both throughout their entire pregnancies, believing it to be a healthy beverage, further compromising the unborn child's development. And don't even get started on their typically poor nutrition, which further compromise both mother and child, leading to weakened immune systems and susceptibility to disease. The death of a child is one of the most awful tragedies anyone can imagine, and in medieval Europe, the overall child mortality rate was thought to lie somewhere between a grim 20 to 30% for children dying under the age of 7, depending on the specific year and region. This meant children dying from incidents during birth, from tragic accidents in and around the home, or most commonly, from the ravages of war, famine, and rampant disease. Deadly illnesses that can easily be treated today with a simple vaccine or antibiotics, like whooping cough, measles, influenza, and various stomach infections, were uncurable killers, sweeping through communities with devastating efficiency, and the profound, soul-crushing grief for parents was just the same, just as agonizing, whether they lived in medieval Europe or thousands of miles away in medieval Japan, where a horrifying 48% of the population died as children. That's practically 1 in every 2 children perishing before reaching adulthood, leaving behind a trail of unimaginable sorrow. The justice system of the Middle Ages, and its associated crimes and punishments, were dramatically different from anything we know today, often brutal, arbitrary, and swift, because the church controlled just about every aspect of life, from what you wore to what you could eat and when you could eat it. Breaking societal norms often meant breaking religious law, which carried severe consequences. There were no police forces as we understand them, no organized patrols or investigative units. If you were the victim of a crime, your only recourse was to scream loudly, to raise a hue and cry, and desperately hope for the best, relying solely on your neighbor's willingness to intervene and assist. Often, no one would. For serious crimes, death was the common punishment, and these didn't just include murder or treason against the king. Forgery, arson, receiving stolen goods, robbery, and burglary were all capital offenses, punishable by hanging, sometimes publicly, to serve as a gruesome deterrent. In fact, stealing anything worth over 12 pence, the equivalent of about 3 weeks' wages for a common laborer, meant an automatic trip to the gallows, a chilling reflection of the value placed on property over human life. Early in the period, the terrifying concept of trial by ordeal was a stark reality, rooted in a belief that God would intervene to reveal the truth. Here, the guilt or innocence of the accused was determined by subjecting the suspect to a painful and often deadly experience, such as walking barefoot over red-hot coals or plunging your bare hand into boiling water or oil. The belief was that if you were truly innocent, God would perform a miracle and save you from injury, or ensure that your wounds healed perfectly without infection. If you suffered, if the burns festered, it was divine proof of your guilt, sealing your fate. Petty crimes, like being in debt, gambling, playing football on a holy day, or using abusive language in the street, were also dealt with quite harshly. Punishments ranged from public humiliation and agony in the stocks or pillory, where you would be exposed to the elements and the scorn of the community, to branding with hot irons, or even imprisonment in dark, damp, filthy dungeons. Many people, once imprisoned, died in prison itself because of the horrific unsanitary conditions, the rampant disease, and the utter lack of decent food and water, turning a sentence of incarceration into a death sentence. Most crime, it must be noted, was intrinsically linked to the rampant poverty that plagued the lower classes, so theft was incredibly prevalent, a desperate act born of survival. And finally, war, what it isn't good for, then or now. The list of wars that ravaged the world during the 1,000-year period of the Middle Ages is simply insane, a testament to constant conflict. In total, there were over 370 documented wars across many empires, with the last major one, the Italian War, only finishing in 1504, bringing an end to the period. Many were fought simply to determine which incompetent noble was going to sit on the throne next as king or queen, or to settle petty territorial disputes, while others were contested for what were thought to be noble reasons, such as the religious crusades to reclaim the Holy Land, or feudal wars between lords. But then, as it tragically often is today, it was always the common people who were left to pay the ultimate brutal price, whether through conscription, taxation, or outright slaughter. As a serf, living under the pervasive European feudal system, if you found yourself living in the kingdom of one of two rich, powerful individuals who decided to wage war against each other, then you would be automatically obligated to fight. Peasants had to supply military service to their liege lord on a regular basis, forced to abandon their fields and families to march into battle. Men were often only sent away for short periods of time, typically around 40 days, because if everyone went off to war at the same time, there would be no one left to take care of the nobles' lands, no labor to grow crops, and thus no money or sustenance for all the wealthy people to spend on silly wars. The result was a medieval military that was, for the most part, disorganized, poorly equipped with little more than a spear or a pitchfork, and largely untrained, leading to a catastrophic number of dead people. Battlefields were chaotic, gruesome affairs, often ending in massacres. Even the nobility didn't entirely evade death, though their lives were significantly more comfortable. Around 30% of them died in one skirmish or another, a notable risk for their class. As for the commoners, the peasant soldiers and the innocent bystanders caught up in the conflict, no one really knows the true victim numbers. They were thought to be so insignificant that nobody ever kept a tally, their deaths mere footnotes in the chronicles of their lords. We can only estimate the casualties from medieval wars, and the numbers are truly horrifying. During the First Crusade at the Siege of Jerusalem, a horrifying 90,000 people died in one brutal event. In all during the Crusade years, from 1095 until the end of the 13th century, there were between 1 to 3 million deaths across Europe and the Middle East, a staggering toll for religious fervor. The Hundred Years' War, fought between England and France from 1337 and 1453, produced between 2 and 3.5 million fatalities, devastating entire regions. And in Asia, the vast Mongol invasions and conquests that took place during the 13th and 14th centuries ended with the unimaginable loss of between 30 and 40 million lives, reshaping entire continents. It really truly wasn't a good time to be a soldier or a peasant, as the threat of violent death was a constant looming shadow. What specific part of Dark Ages daily life do you think you'd find surprisingly tolerable, despite all the immense, crushing hardship, if any part at all? Be brutally honest with yourself, and share your deepest, darkest, most absurd thoughts in the comments below. So as you sip your clean, filtered water, scroll effortlessly on your glowing smartphone screen, and finally rest in your perfectly temperature-controlled home, take a profound moment to truly appreciate the sheer, unprecedented luxury of your existence. Our ancestors, whether in ancient Egypt or the Dark Ages, endured unimaginable hardships, facing relentless, life-threatening challenges on a daily basis that would unequivocally break most of us within mere hours. Their resilience, their sheer will to survive and persevere against such overwhelming odds, is truly astonishing. If this immersive journey into the brutal realities of the Dark Ages made you appreciate your toilet, your clean water, or your freedom just a little bit more, then hit that like button. Subscribe for more deep dives into forgotten histories and untold realities, and please share this video with someone who perhaps thinks they're tough and could handle a day in the past. Your engagement truly helps us keep unearthing these often uncomfortable truths, allowing us to learn from the past and appreciate the present. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next forgotten story. You think you know Henry VIII, the guy with 6 wives who founded the Church of England? Well, buckle up, because the real Henry VIII was so much worse than any history textbook dares to tell you. A king so grotesquely obese that he needed mechanical devices just to move around. His once athletic physique a distant, forgotten memory. A man whose rotting leg wounds festered for years, smelling so horrific that even his most loyal servants would literally run away gagging, clutching perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces. A ruler whose own body was falling apart so dramatically that upon his death, his coffin didn't just leak, it exploded from the gases of his violently decomposing corpse, scattering royal remains. Before we descend into this often uncomfortable truth, tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? Are you nestled in a cozy modern home, perhaps enduring a long commute, or simply seeking a moment of quiet reflection? hidden from the general chaos of life. Drop a comment below and let me know your location and the time, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Your engagement truly helps us continue to unearth these often forgotten stories. You're about to discover the shocking, gruesome, and utterly bizarre curiosities about Henry VIII that make even the most dramatic episodes of Game of Thrones look like a children's fairy tale. From his inexplicable eating rituals, which consumed entire livestock and required a small army of chefs, to his escalating, suffocating paranoia that transformed his court into a psychological horror show. From his treatment of wives that went far beyond mere execution, delving into calculated psychological torment, to the grotesque, undignified reality of his final years, and even his death itself. These are the unsettling facts, hidden in dusty archives and often glossed over, that will irrevocably change everything you thought you knew about England's most infamous and truly monstrous king. Prepare yourselves, for the truth is far more putrid than the legends. His body was a walking disaster. Let's start with the most visceral and shocking truth about Henry VIII. By the very end of his reign, he wasn't merely ill or overweight. He was, to put it bluntly, literally a walking, breathing corpse. His body failing him in the most spectacular and repulsive ways imaginable. We're talking about a man whose once legendary athletic physique had transformed into something so grotesque, so profoundly unwell, that even his own hardened servants, accustomed to the brutal realities of court life, were visibly traumatized by his presence. Accounts from the period, whispered amongst courtiers and later penned in hesitant letters, paint a horrifying picture. Henry's waist, once trim and powerful, had ballooned to an astounding 54 inches. To truly grasp the scale of this, consider that in an era where the average man stood perhaps 5.5 feet tall, 54 inches is a measurement that exceeds the height of many individuals. He weighed an estimated 400 lebsibs, a staggering mass in an era when the average man weighed a mere 140 pounds. This was not simply a case of a king indulging in too much rich food. Something far more insidious was at play, turning his body into a massive, festering monument to his decline. But here's the truly horrifying, stomach-turning part. It wasn't just the morbid obesity that defined his final agonizing years. His legs, once strong enough for jousting and hunting, were covered in festering, weeping, open wounds that never, ever healed. These weren't just small cuts or minor sores. We are talking about massive chronic ulcers that continuously oozed pus, blood, and decaying flesh. The sheer, overwhelming stench that emanated from these necrotic wounds was so potent, so utterly repulsive, that courtiers, hardened by the lack of hygiene in Tudor England, would instinctively hold perfumed handkerchiefs or even small bouquets of flowers to their faces when duty demanded they approach the king. Imagine the scene: a bustling royal court, vibrant with silks and jewels, yet pervaded by an invisible, putrid cloud. Some chilling historical accounts describe the stench as being detectable not just from across a room, but from several rooms away, infiltrating the very tapestries and furniture of the palace. The task of assisting the king with his daily dressing, which involved confronting these horrific lesions up close, was considered such a vile and dreadful duty that servants actually drew straws to determine who would be subjected to this form of literal punishment. To be in Henry's presence was to be assaulted by the putrefaction of his own living flesh. But wait, it gets even worse, delving into the realm of modern medical conjecture that casts Henry's later tyranny in a new, chilling light. Many contemporary medical experts, reviewing historical accounts and symptoms, now believe Henry suffered from a severe traumatic brain injury. This wasn't merely a bump on the head, it stemmed from a devastating jousting accident in 1536, where he was thrown from his horse and rendered unconscious for a harrowing 2 hours. In 16th century terms, to be unconscious for that long was to be practically dead, a brush with mortality from which he seemingly never fully recovered, at least mentally. This traumatic brain injury, speculate many historians and neurologists, likely caused profound and irreversible personality changes, offering a disturbing, yet perhaps partial explanation for his dramatic transformation. He devolved from the relatively charming, intellectual, and athletic young king of his early reign into the paranoid, capricious, rage-filled, and utterly merciless monster of his later years. You don't typically learn this in history classes, but beyond the brain injury, Henry also probably had a serious endocrine disorder called Cushing's syndrome. This condition, caused by prolonged exposure to high levels of cortisol, would perfectly explain his dramatic and rapid weight gain. his extreme and unpredictable mood swings, and crucially, those horrific, persistent leg ulcers that absolutely refused to heal. The irony was brutal. While Henry was obsessed with his legacy and his image, his body was in open rebellion, mirroring the chaos he inflicted on his kingdom. Adding to this medical horror, his own physicians, despite their knowledge, were so utterly terrified of his volatile temper that they wouldn't dare suggest he might be seriously ill, let alone imply that his lifestyle choices were contributing to his demise. Criticizing the king's health, or indeed any aspect of his person, was considered a direct act of treason, punishable by agonizing death. This left Henry surrounded by a sycophantic court, none daring to offer honest medical advice. And as if his physical decay wasn't enough, the man who claimed divine right to rule couldn't even control his most basic bodily functions. In his final, bloated years, royal attendants had the grim duty of carrying specially designed portable chairs everywhere he went. Henry could barely make it from one room to another without the indignity of having a bowel movement accident. This is the same tyrannical guy who, just years prior, had executed people for merely looking at him the wrong way, now reduced to a pathetic, dependent state, a grotesque parody of his former power. The wives had it even worse than you think. Everyone knows Henry VIII had 6 wives, and that 2 of them met their end on the executioner's block. It's a sensationalized part of history, often reduced to a catchy rhyme, but the terrifying reality of what those women endured goes far, far beyond a simple beheading or annulment. We're talking about a level of calculated psychological torture and manipulation that would make even the most depraved modern serial killers pause. Henry didn't just discard his wives, he broke them, publicly shamed them, and often forced them into unimaginable mental anguish. Take Anne Boleyn, perhaps the most famous of his executed queens. Before her beheading, Henry didn't just make a cold decision to eliminate her. He orchestrated an elaborate, cruel, and meticulously planned frame-up, weaving a web of false accusations of adultery, incest, and treason. This involved forcing her own musician, Mark Smeaton, to confess under agonizing torture to having an affair with her, a confession almost certainly extracted under duress. But here's the truly sick, unimaginable part. Henry, the ultimate puppet master, reportedly made Anne Boleyn watch from her prison window in the Tower of London, as 5 men, including her own beloved brother, George Boleyn, were executed for allegedly sleeping with her. Imagine her agony. She had to stand there, helpless, knowing she was next, forced to witness innocent people die agonizing deaths, all because of her husband's escalating paranoia and desperate need to be rid of her. It was a spectacle designed to crush her spirit before her body. Then there was Catherine Howard, Henry's 5th wife, who got it even worse in some respects. She was barely out of her teens, essentially a teenager, when Henry, a morbidly obese and ailing man, married her. When he discovered her past innocent relationships, a fury of possessiveness consumed him. He didn't just execute her, he went further, making it a legal precedent. He personally pushed through Parliament a monstrous law, the Act of Attainder, making it treason for anyone to marry the king or queen without first revealing their complete sexual history. Imagine being so petty, so consumed by your own insecurity and rage, that you changed the entire legal system of England because your teenage wife wasn't a virgin upon marriage to you. It was a direct, humiliating public indictment of her, designed to retroactively justify his tyrannical actions. But beyond the executions and legal maneuverings, the psychological games Henry played were arguably the most insidious form of torture. He was a master of emotional manipulation. He would shower his wives with extravagant gifts, effusive affection, and promises of eternal devotion one day, only to completely ignore them, subject them to chilling silences, or openly threaten their lives and their family's safety the next. This constant, unpredictable cycle of love bombing and terror kept them in a perpetual state of fear and emotional instability. Consider Catherine of Aragon, his first wife. After years of marriage, she spent her final, heartbreaking years essentially under house arrest, cruelly separated from her beloved daughter Mary, who she was forbidden from seeing. All the while, Henry viciously spread rumors that she was mentally ill and deranged, attempting to discredit her in the eyes of his court and the world. She died alone, isolated in Kimbolton Castle, possibly poisoned by those eager to please the king, writing desperate, heartfelt letters to Henry that he never even bothered to read. The man treated human beings like disposable objects, pawns in his grand, self-serving game for a male heir and absolute power. Here's something that will truly blow your mind. Henry actually forced his wives to sign documents agreeing to their own divorces or annulments. Anne of Cleves, his fourth wife, was so utterly terrified of him, witnessing the fates of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, that she readily agreed to a fake marriage annulment, fabricating reasons for its invalidity just to avoid execution. She basically had to pretend their marriage never even happened, and then, in a final twisted indignity, she had to publicly thank him for the privilege of not being murdered. And Jane Seymour, often painted as the lucky one because she died of natural causes. She died from complications after giving birth to Henry's longed-for son, Edward VI, but her death didn't bring solemn mourning from the king. Henry was already eyeing up his next wife, Anne of Cleves, before Jane's body was even cold. He waited a chilling exact 9 days after her funeral to start actively planning his next marriage. The man's profound lack of empathy, his perception of women as mere vessels for his dynastic ambitions, is truly sickening. And the worst part is that these women, trapped in a patriarchal society, had absolutely no escape. Divorce wasn't an option for them. Running away meant certain death and public dishonor, and fighting back meant not just your own brutal execution, but potentially the complete destruction of your entire family and lineage. Their lives were a terrifying gamble at the hands of a volatile king. His eating habits were absolutely insane. If you think modern competitive eating contests are crazy today, wait until you hear about the sheer mind-boggling scale of Henry VIII's daily food consumption. This man didn't just eat like a king, he ate like he was actively trying to single-handedly cause a famine across his entire kingdom. Modern estimates, based on detailed court records, suggest Henry consumed roughly 5,000 calories per day, an absolutely enormous amount for anyone. For context, that's more than double, sometimes triple, what an active adult male should consume, even one engaging in rigorous physical activity. And remember, this guy could barely walk by the end of his life. His diet was a grotesque monument to his unchecked gluttony, and a significant contributor to his enormous weight and failing health. But the sheer quantity of food wasn't even the weirdest, most fascinating part. It was what he ate and how he ate it that reveals the depths of his eccentricities and paranoia. A typical meal for Henry wasn't just a few courses. It was a lavish, over-the-top feast that could include an entire roasted pig, multiple whole chickens, several types of exotic and local fish, mountains of heavy, rich bread, and enough wine to metaphorically float a small boat. His royal kitchen staff, a staggering army of culinary professionals, prepared over 800 different dishes every single day just for his household, with Henry personally sampling dozens of them at each meal. The royal kitchens, a sprawling complex, employed over 200 people working around the clock: butchers, bakers, brewers, cooks, scullery maids, all dedicated solely to keeping up with his insatiable appetite and the demands of royal feasts. But here's where it gets truly bizarre, dipping into the realm of medieval superstition and royal ego. Henry was convinced that certain foods had magical, almost alchemical properties that would enhance his royal attributes. He genuinely believed that eating swan would make him more graceful and majestic, befitting a king. Consuming massive amounts of venison and other wild game, particularly deer, he thought would make him a better, more formidable hunter. And most comically, he was convinced that gargantuan quantities of oysters would enhance his performance with his wives, particularly for producing a male heir. So he'd gorge himself on these specific power foods in truly massive quantities, almost like some kind of medieval superfood obsession, believing they were essential to his royal vigor, despite all evidence to the contrary from his rotting health. The man also had the strangest, most theatrical eating rituals. Born out of his overwhelming paranoia, every single morsel of food that was destined to enter Henry's royal mouth was first tasted by multiple servants, acting as dedicated food tasters, meticulously checking for poison. This was a common practice among monarchs, but Henry took it to an extreme. Get this, he was so profoundly paranoid that he required his food tasters to wait a full 30 minutes after consuming a portion of his meal before he would even touch anything himself. This was to ensure they didn't suddenly drop dead from some kind of slow-acting poison. Henry's meals were, therefore, not just meals, they were elaborate, drawn-out theatrical performances. He'd eat in front of hundreds of courtiers, silent witnesses to this ritual, and the entire process could take up to 4 hours. Imagine sitting there, respectfully, watching this massive, increasingly immobile, and rotting king slowly work his way through enough food to feed a small village, all while pretending this was perfectly normal, even majestic, royal behavior. You don't typically learn this in history classes, but Henry actually banned certain foods from his court, not because they were unhealthy or scarce, but because he thought they were utterly beneath his royal status. Common people's food, like humble turnips, simple barley, or even plain vegetables, were literally illegal at his table. This was despite the fact that a more balanced diet, including such simple fare, probably would have been infinitely better for his health than the mountains of rich fatty meat and sugar he consumed daily. The truly insane part is that even as his body was literally falling apart from the consequences of his diet, even as the ulcers on his legs became an open testament to his internal decay, Henry compulsively kept eating more and more, convinced in his delusional royal mind that his divine status somehow made him immune to the mundane consequences of his gluttony. The paranoia that ruled an empire. Henry VIII's paranoia wasn't just your typical trust-no-one attitude, a mere side effect of power. This man cultivated and enforced a chilling atmosphere of fear that turned his entire kingdom into a vast, intricate surveillance state, a system that would make even modern dictators green with envy. By his final desperate years, Henry was so profoundly convinced that everyone, from his closest advisors to his own family members, was plotting against him, that he systematically transformed royal life into a living, waking nightmare for everyone around him. The air at court was thick with suspicion, every conversation a potential trap, every gesture scrutinized. Let's start with his private, innermost sanctum, his sleeping arrangements. The king, ostensibly the most secure man in England, slept with loaded crossbows readily accessible next to his bed and kept multiple sharp daggers secreted under his pillow. But even these personal defenses weren't enough to quell the demons of his mind. He further demanded that heavily armed guards be stationed inside his very bedroom, watching him sleep through the entire night, their silent vigil a constant reminder of his deep-seated fear. Imagine the chilling reality, being so utterly terrified of assassination, of a dagger in the dark, that you couldn't even close your eyes without witnesses, knowing armed men were observing your most vulnerable state. Sleep offered no true escape from his terror. The royal palaces themselves, once grand symbols of power and artistry, became fortresses of paranoia. Henry, consumed by his fears, ordered the clandestine construction of numerous secret passages, hidden stairwells, and concealed compartments throughout every building he resided in. These weren't for romantic trysts or convenient shortcuts. They were meticulously designed escape routes, so he could flee if assassins managed to breach his formidable defenses. Furthermore, his obsession with surveillance extended to installing concealed peepholes in walls, allowing him to spy on his own unsuspecting courtiers. Hidden listening devices, ingeniously placed behind tapestries or within intricate carvings, were installed in meeting rooms, enabling him to eavesdrop on supposedly private conversations, turning casual remarks into potential treasonous whispers. But here's where it gets truly insane, spiraling into a Kafkaesque nightmare of suspicion. Henry created an entire multi-layered network of spies, whose primary job was to spy on his other spies. He had informants watching his informants, who were in turn watching more informants, creating this twisted, self-devouring web of surveillance where absolutely nobody knew who they could truly trust. Court life became a psychological horror show, a constant tightrope walk where saying the wrong thing, or even an innocent facial expression interpreted incorrectly by the wrong person, could literally get you executed for treason. The fear of false accusation was as potent as the fear of genuine conspiracy. His food paranoia, already touched upon, reached absolutely ridiculous, almost theatrical levels. Not only did he have multiple food tasters for every dish, but he required his meals to be prepared in completely sealed kitchens, veritable fortresses within the palace, with armed guards meticulously watching every single step of the cooking process. The salt, the spices, even the water used in his meals. Everything had to be tested by different trusted individuals, forming a complex chain of command designed to prevent his poisoning. He was so utterly convinced that someone somewhere would attempt to poison him that the simple act of eating a meal became a meticulously planned military operation, a daily battle against an unseen enemy. The man's suspicion even extended to his own blood. He notoriously suspected his own children of plotting against him. He had spies placed to watch Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, his own daughters, even when they were young and powerless, because he was consumed by the delusional belief that they were actively planning to overthrow him. These were mere children, vulnerable and dependent, and he treated them like hardened enemy agents in their own home, eroding any familial trust or affection. Henry's paranoia got so extreme that it transcended reality. He started executing people for crimes they hadn't even committed yet, or crimes that existed only in his fevered imagination. He'd order someone killed because he allegedly dreamed they had betrayed him, or because a sycophantic courtier, eager to gain favor, suggested they might be disloyal in the future. The infamous Tower of London was constantly full of people whose only discernible crime was simply existing near Henry while he was in one of his increasingly frequent, terrifyingly paranoid moods. The truly terrifying part, the contagion of fear, is that Henry's paranoia was so potent, so pervasive, that it infected his entire court. Nobles started spying on each other, turning friend against friend, family member against family member. Servants, desperate for survival or imaginary rewards, betrayed their masters based on flimsy suspicions, and everyone lived in constant palpable fear that they'd be the next arbitrary victim of the king's increasingly delusional and murderous suspicions. Death couldn't even stop the chaos. You'd think Henry VIII's tyrannical reign of terror, his endless cruelty and self-inflicted misery, would finally end with his death, bringing a semblance of peace to those around him. Right? Wrong. This man was so utterly committed to being a complete disaster, a force of unprecedented mayhem, that even his decaying corpse managed to cause absolute stomach-churning chaos. His very passing was a final grotesque act in his lifelong drama. Let's start with his agonizing final weeks. Henry, having ballooned to an unimaginable size and crippled by his festering leg wounds, was so massive that he literally couldn't walk on his own. His strained servants had the Sisyphean task of carrying him everywhere, employing a specially designed reinforced chair with an intricate system of pulleys and wheels. But here's the truly disgusting, unforgettable detail. His chronic leg wounds had become so profoundly infected, so utterly gangrenous, that pieces of rotting, putrefying flesh would literally fall off his body as his attendants laboriously moved him from room to room. Servants, often gagging, had the grim duty of following behind him with cloths and buckets to clean up the chunks of decomposing king that dropped onto the palace's ground floors, leaving a trail of decay in his wake. His actual death scene, on January 28, 1547, was like something ripped straight from a horror movie. Henry's body had swollen to such grotesque, unnatural proportions that his skin was stretched taut and shiny, almost bursting. The stench of his decay was so overwhelming, so viscerally repulsive, that even his hardened doctors, who were intimately familiar with the brutal realities and putrid horrors of medieval medical practices, had to periodically leave the room to vomit, unable to bear the reek. When he finally drew his last rasping breath, such was the fear and revulsion he inspired, that nobody wanted to get close enough to officially confirm he was truly, irrevocably dead. They kept their distance, waiting, almost hoping, for his torment to finally cease. But wait, it gets so much worse, reaching levels of the absurdly macabre. Henry's body, already enormous, became so bloated with the gases of internal decomposition, the natural, but in his case amplified, processes of putrefaction, that his specially constructed coffin had to be additionally reinforced. They had wrapped his massive corpse in layers of heavy lead sheets and meticulously sealed it within multiple robust wooden boxes, thinking, foolishly, that this elaborate containment would finally manage the inevitable, horrifying mess. They were spectacularly, utterly wrong. During the lengthy funeral procession, a solemn, dignified journey from London to his final resting place at Windsor Castle, something absolutely unbelievably grotesque happened. The coffin, despite all its reinforcements, literally exploded. The immense pressure generated by the gases from Henry's rapidly decomposing body built up to such an unbearable degree that the lead lining burst open and rotting royal remains, liquefied and gaseous, splattered violently all over the inside of the hearse, seeping out onto the road. The accompanying smell was so horrific, so profoundly nauseating, that the entire funeral procession, a meticulously planned royal spectacle, had to come to a grinding halt, while frantic servants, gagging and retching, cleaned up the putrid mess with buckets and rags. It was an utter public indignity. Here's a detail that will haunt your dreams and firmly cement the ignominy of his end. As the procession moved on, leaving behind the gruesome scene, hungry, scavenging dogs were reportedly seen licking up the actual, decomposing remains of Henry VIII that had leaked from his shattered coffin onto the muddy country road. The man who had proclaimed himself to rule by divine right, who wielded absolute power, executed his wives, and terrorized his court, ended up as literal dog food on a common highway. A final, brutal irony, for a life lived with such unbridled arrogance. Even his burial became a disaster. They had to dig his grave extra wide to accommodate the massive coffin and its lead-encased contents. But the ground beneath the chapel kept collapsing under the immense weight. The soil simply couldn't support the sheer tonnage of all that lead and rotting flesh, leading to multiple frustrating attempts just to get the king's remains into the ground and keep them there, a final act of rebellion from the very earth itself. The chaos, however, didn't end with his burial. For years afterward, strange noises and terrible smells were reportedly heard and detected coming from Henry's tomb. Some superstitious souls claimed it was his restless ghost, unable to find peace even in death. More grounded historians, however, suggest it was probably just more gases continuously escaping from his still, slowly, horrifically decomposing remains, a lingering, putrid reminder of the tyrant beneath the chapel floor. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but Henry's death and the gruesome handling of his body was so traumatic for everyone involved that several of the servants who were forced to handle his decaying corpse reportedly died within weeks of his funeral, possibly from infections they caught from direct contact with his rotting flesh. Their lives too were consumed by the king's terrifying end. So there you have it, the real Henry VIII. Not the charismatic, idealized king of popular culture, but a walking, talking disaster whose own body spectacularly betrayed him, just as dramatically as he betrayed everyone and everything around him. A man so utterly consumed by uncontrollable paranoia, insatiable gluttony, and a monstrous ego that he systematically turned one of Europe's most powerful and vibrant kingdoms into his personal horror show. The most powerful man in England became, in his final years, a pathetic, immobile prisoner of his own decaying body, and even death itself, the ultimate end, couldn't quell his capacity for causing absolute, visceral chaos. His enduring legacy isn't just the Church of England or the tragic fates of his 6 wives. It's a chilling, unforgettable masterclass in how absolute, unchecked power can utterly corrupt a human being, transforming them into something genuinely monstrous. If these disturbing, bizarre, and horrifying royal facts made you question everything you thought you knew about history, maybe hit that subscribe button, because there are plenty more gruesome, untold truths that textbooks conveniently leave out. And trust me, you haven't heard anything yet.